Elena knelt in the confessional, heart pounding louder than the rain pressing against the stained glass windows, her fingers nervously twisting the silver cross that hung around her neck, worn smooth from years of whispered prayers and silent questions. For a long moment she said nothing, the stillness inside the church swallowing her uncertainty. Then, in a breath that barely escaped her lips, she spoke, voice soft and trembling. "I think I've committed a sin." The screen between them offered no reply, only the quiet patience of the man who had been her father, her guide, and her moral compass since she was 5 years old. "I think I've fallen in love," she continued, her voice more sure now, but tinged with a sorrow that felt heavier than guilt. "With someone who doesn't belong here, someone not from this town, not from this life, not even from the world I've always believed in." Her confession hung in the air, thick with unshed tears and the weight of something deeper than longing. Outside, thunder rolled over the Vermont hills, low and distant, like a warning that didn't quite reach them. Inside, the candle flames trembled gently, casting flickers of light against the worn stone walls. Elena was 23, and for as long as she could remember, this chapel had been her entire universe. The old pews, her playground, the hymnals, her lullabies, and Father Daniel, the man who found her abandoned on the church steps, her protector and mentor, who taught her how to see beauty in simplicity and strength in silence. She had never questioned her place in this quiet life until 2 months ago, when a stranger stepped through the chapel doors during a blizzard that turned the entire town into a white blur of isolation and stillness. That night, she had been extinguishing candles, humming an old lullaby, when the heavy door creaked open and the wind followed him in. The man was tall, soaked to the bone, bruised and bleeding from the temple, his voice rough and raw when he asked, "Is this a safe place?" And something in his eyes made her nod before she even realized she was doing it. He said his name was Jack, nothing more, and from that night forward he returned often, always quiet, always late, sitting alone in the last pew or standing at the back, watching the stained glass as if hoping to understand the stories they told. Elena didn't ask questions, and he didn't offer answers, but over time they talked. Sometimes about the weather, sometimes about forgiveness, and sometimes about nothing at all, just letting the silence speak for them. One evening she offered him a cup of tea in the rectory kitchen, and he accepted, saying thank you with a sincerity that felt disarming, and for the first time she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She didn't know who he was or what his world looked like beyond the snow-covered chapel steps, but she knew how he made her feel when he listened to her sing, or when his gaze lingered a second too long, and that feeling began to haunt her prayers. She had always thought love belonged in books, that her life was meant to be small and pure and simple, but now, every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, not in sin, but in something holy she couldn't quite name. Pressing. "It doesn't even talk about faith," she whispered, still inside the booth, "but when he's near me, I feel like I believe more than I ever have." No response came, and maybe that was grace, because she wasn't looking for forgiveness. She was looking for clarity, for a sign. Rising slowly, Elena stepped out of the confessional, her feet light, but her chest heavy. And when she turned toward the church doors, she froze. There, standing in the threshold once again, rain dripping from his coat and something fragile in his eyes, was Jack, and in his hand he held a single rose. Elena had always known silence more intimately than noise, having grown up within the gentle walls of St. Agnes Chapel, nestled in the wooded hills of rural Vermont, where the wind spoke through pine trees and prayers rose with the morning mist. She was not born into faith, but rescued by it, left swaddled in a wool blanket on the church steps one bitter winter night when she was only 5 years old. Father Daniel found her there, barely conscious, her small hand clutching a broken bracelet and her cheeks pale from the cold. He took her in without hesitation, called her a miracle, and raised her as his own daughter in the rectory behind the chapel. Elena never asked about her biological parents, and Father Daniel never offered the truth, instead teaching her that family was not who brought you into the world, but who chose to stay and guide you through it. Life under his roof was quiet, structured by morning hymns, evening prayers, and days spent tending to the garden or organizing donations for families in need. Elena found comfort in predictability and purpose in service, her days filled with simple joys like lighting candles before sunrise or helping an elderly neighbor with her groceries. Her world was small, but in her eyes it was full. The townspeople respected her deeply, often referring to her as the chapel's angel, a young woman with gentle hands and a soft singing voice, who never asked for anything yet always gave more than expected. She worked part-time at the town's bookstore, sang in the Sunday choir, and spent her evenings in the chapel, playing piano or reading in the pews. The chapel was her sanctuary and her home, and she never imagined her life needing anything beyond its stone walls and stained glass. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The man who first entered the church during a snowstorm had not come with reverence or answers, only silence and fatigue and something unreadable in his gaze. He had stumbled in wearing an expensive coat, soaked through with snow, a deep cut above his brow, and eyes that seemed used to having power but unfamiliar with peace. Elena had not known his name that night, and when he finally said it was Jack, it did not sound entirely honest, but it didn't matter. She brought him a towel, asked no questions, and watched as he sat alone at the back of the church staring at the flickering candles with a kind of hunger she had never seen. Over the next few weeks, he returned, never speaking more than he needed to, always arriving late and leaving before sunrise. Sometimes he lit a candle, sometimes he sat for hours, his head bowed and his breathing uneven, as though the weight of some invisible burden kept his spine bent and his spirit dimmed. One night, Elena left 2 mugs of tea on the back pew, and to her surprise he stayed, drinking in silence beside her. That night, he asked if the stars still looked the same in this town as they did 20 years ago, and when she looked confused, he smiled faintly and said it didn't matter. She didn't press him. There was something in the way he spoke, each word chosen carefully like it might cost him something to say too much, that made her instinctively patient. She found herself watching for his visits, noticing the way he relaxed in the quiet, the way his shoulders loosened as her music filled the chapel, and she began to wonder what kind of life could carve such weariness into someone so young. What she didn't know, and what he never shared, was that Jack wasn't just a wanderer in search of shelter, but Julian Blackwell, the estranged heir to one of the most powerful tech fortunes in the country. After a bitter falling out with his mother over the company's direction and her manipulation of employees through backdoor deals, he had walked away from the board, from the city, from his name. The accident that left his forehead bruised and his coat bloodied wasn't random. It was the consequence of trying to expose the corruption inside his own empire and being punished by those who had more to lose. He came to Vermont not to be found, but to disappear, believing no one would recognize him in a town without skyscrapers or headlines, a place where he could remember how it felt to breathe without expectation. In Elena, he had seen something he didn't understand but deeply needed. She reminded him of peace, of truth, of a kind of faith that didn't demand perfection but offered acceptance. In him, she saw someone broken but unashamed, someone honest in his silence and real in a way no one else had ever been. The chapel that had always been her home became a bridge between 2 worlds. Hers built on simplicity and hope, his on secrets and shame. What neither of them realized yet was that the path they were walking, so cautiously, so quietly, would soon pull them both into a truth far deeper than either was prepared for, a truth that would force them to choose not just between love and safety, but between the lives they knew and the futures they dared to imagine. In the weeks that followed, the town of Halebrook settled into a slow, snow-blanketed winter, where time stretched long and quiet between sunrise and nightfall, and the chapel grew colder but never empty. Elena found herself slipping into a rhythm she didn't expect, a rhythm shaped by more than just hymns and candlelight. Jack, though she still only knew him by that name, began arriving earlier, sometimes helping her carry in logs for the wood stove, sometimes sitting near the altar as she practiced her singing. He never asked for more than her presence, never crossed a line, but there was something unspoken in the air between them that neither could ignore. It was in the way he listened when she played the piano, leaning slightly forward as though the notes held something he was afraid to miss. It was in the way she turned her head just slightly when he entered, her breath catching for a moment before she remembered herself. Elena told herself this was nothing more than companionship, two strangers bound by silence and the cold, two lost souls sharing warmth without words. But the truth pressed heavier each day, filling the space between them, until even the chapel's sacred walls couldn't contain it. One evening, as she lit candles before the Vesper prayer, he stood behind her, close, but not too close, his voice low and hesitant as he said, "I used to think places like this were just stone and tradition. But there's something different here, or maybe it's just you." Her hands froze over the brass candle holder, the flame trembling as if it too had heard the shift in his tone. She didn't answer, didn't know how, and instead whispered the final prayer and stepped away. But her pulse wouldn't slow even long after he had gone. The townspeople began to notice. Father Daniel, always observant, said nothing at first, though his eyes lingered longer when Alina returned home flushed or thoughtful. Mrs. Abernathy, the church cook, remarked once that Alina was glowing lately, like someone who had been kissed by a secret. Alina laughed it off, but her heart raced at the thought because she knew something inside her was changing, something that didn't fit neatly into the life she had always known. She started dreaming again, something she hadn't done in years, of places beyond Halebrook, of music halls filled with light, of laughter that didn't end when the song did. In those dreams, Jack was always beside her. The first time they touched, it wasn't planned. She had slipped on the icy church steps while carrying hymn books to the vestibule, and he caught her by the elbow, steadying her with surprising ease. Their eyes met, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his irises, and for a second, neither moved. Her breath fanned out in the cold air between them, and he said nothing, only let her go gently, his hand lingering for a moment too long. That night she wrote in her journal something she hadn't done since childhood, scribbling words she barely understood about warmth in winter, about eyes that saw through walls, about the ache of wanting something she couldn't name. Jack, for his part, tried to resist. He had come to Halebrook to disappear, not to find salvation. Every instinct in him screamed that this was dangerous, that if she knew who he really was, she would pull away. But the more time he spent with her, the more he realized that her kindness wasn't fragile. It was forged from something deeper than he had ever encountered. She didn't pity him, didn't ask for explanations, and didn't try to fix him. She just existed beside him, like the snow falling quietly outside, steady and relentless, and beautiful in a way that made him want to stay still, for the first time in years. One late evening, after she had finished her solo rehearsal in the chapel, Jack lingered as she gathered her things. She hummed an old hymn, one her father used to sing when the nights were long and the wind howled too loud for sleep. Jack asked about the song, and she explained its meaning: hope in the darkness, strength in waiting. He listened, then said softly, "You make waiting feel like purpose." She smiled, unsure whether to thank him or flee. Instead, she said, "Sometimes waiting is all faith really is," and turned to blow out the last candle. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, full of moments that had been building towards something neither of them could ignore any longer. The next day, Father Daniel asked Elena to join him in the study. He had grown quiet lately, his sermons shorter, his eyes sharper. He didn't waste words. "I see the way you look at him," he said without preamble, "and I see the way he watches you." Elena felt the heat rise to her face, her lips parting to deny, but no words came. He continued, "Love is not a sin, Elena, but it must be grounded in truth. That man carries something heavy, and I fear he has not been honest with you." She wanted to defend Jack, but she realized with a sharp pang that she didn't know what to defend. She didn't know where he came from, what he had run from, or even if Jack was his real name. That night, she waited for him at the chapel, but he didn't come. 3 days passed. Then a letter arrived. It was left on the pew where she always sat. No envelope, just a folded page with her name written in a careful hand. Inside it read, "Elena, there are things I haven't told you, not because I wanted to lie, but because I didn't know how to tell the truth without losing what little peace I've found here. I am not who I pretended to be. My real name is Julian Blackwell. I left my life behind because it broke me. I built an empire that stole everything it gave, and when I tried to fix it, the people closest to me turned on me. I was tired, angry, and I didn't believe in anything anymore until I met you. You reminded me of what it means to hope, to believe that someone can see you and not flinch, to feel like maybe redemption isn't something you buy, but something you earn with kindness. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't. If you never want to see me again, I will understand. But if you want the truth, if you want to know who I really am, I'll be waiting at the chapel tonight. Julie." She read the letter 3 times. Then she cried, not because he had lied, but because he had trusted her enough to finally stop. That night, as snow drifted from the eaves and the world quieted into twilight, she walked to the chapel with her hands clenched around the letter and her heart wide open, unsure of what she would say, but knowing that some kinds of truth were worth hearing, even if they hurt. And when she pushed open the door, she saw him standing beneath the stained glass. No longer Jack, no longer a stranger, just a man waiting in the dark, hoping someone would choose him anyway. Julian stood alone in the chapel, his figure barely visible under the flickering glow of the sanctuary lamp that hung like a distant star above the altar. The familiar hush of the sacred space pressed against him, a silence he had once found comforting but now filled with the restless rhythm of his thoughts. His hands remained buried in his coat pockets, not because of the cold, but because they trembled with the weight of anticipation. He had not known fear like this before, not during hostile takeovers, not while navigating scandal, not even the night he signed away his power to walk away from the world he had built. This was different. This fear had a name, and it was Elena. He heard the soft push of the door before he saw her, the creak of old hinges followed by footsteps measured and slow. She stepped into the chapel without a word, her eyes finding him in the dim light as if she had always known where he would be. Her hands held the letter, folded and worn now from how many times she had read it. Her expression was unreadable, not angry, not cold, just still like the surface of water before a storm. He took one step toward her, then stopped. "You came," he said, and his voice barely carried across the space between them. She nodded, once, then looked around the church she had known all her life, the place that had witnessed every version of her from child to woman. "This is where I learned to be honest," she said quietly, "and where I learned that honesty should not require bravery." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, nodding as if the truth of her words struck somewhere deep. "I didn't mean to lie," he began, but she raised a hand, not in anger, but in a quiet request to let her speak first. "You didn't lie," she said slowly, each word deliberate. "You hid. There's a difference. One comes from deceit, the other comes from fear. I think I understand fear better now than I ever did." He waited, hands still in his pockets, the chill of stone beneath his feet seeping through his boots. She stepped closer, her face illuminated now by the stained glass glow above them. "You told me more about yourself in silence than anyone ever has with words," she continued. "But silence is a heavy thing to carry, and I need to know what you've left behind." So he told her. Not with grand gestures or speeches, but with steady words, truths stripped of all pretense. He told her about his mother, the CEO who built an empire from nothing and taught him that loyalty was weakness and empathy a liability. He told her about his decision to walk away from it all, about the journalists who tried to use his story, the board members who tried to erase him, the investors who offered hush money in return for his silence. He told her about the night he was followed, the crash that sent him bleeding into the woods, and how, guided only by instinct and exhaustion, he found the chapel glowing like a beacon through the storm. And finally he told her what he feared most, that the moment she knew who he really was, she would stop seeing the man and start seeing the name. Alina listened without interrupting, her face unreadable, her breath even, her hands finally lowering to her sides. When he finished, she stepped forward again until they stood only a few feet apart. "You know what's strange?" she said gently. "You're the only person I've ever met who walked into this chapel, not looking for answers, but looking for permission to be lost." He laughed softly, not mocking, just grateful. "You make being lost feel almost like belonging," he said. Elena's gaze lingered on him, searching for something in his face, and then she said the one thing he never expected. "You're not the only one with a past you don't talk about." She turned then, walking to the side aisle of the church, and stopped in front of a small brass plaque mounted beside the sixth pew. Julian followed her with his eyes as she placed her hand gently over it. "This is where they found me," she said. "I don't remember it, of course. I was 5, maybe younger, wrapped in a blanket, no note, no name, just a broken bracelet and frostbitten fingers." Julian's eyes followed the delicate bracelet now worn around her wrist, the silver links dulled with age but still whole. "I never asked Father Daniel who I was before. I think I was afraid to know, afraid that I came from nothing, or worse, from someone who chose to leave." Julian stepped beside her then, careful not to intrude. "Or maybe," he said softly, "you came from someone who loved you enough to let you go, believing you'd find something better." She turned to him, her eyes shining with something between sadness and hope. "Maybe," she whispered, "but for a long time I thought love meant staying still. That's what I've done my whole life, stayed still, safe, predictable. But then you walked in like a storm and I started questioning everything." They stood in silence again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, just full. Then she asked the question he had been dreading. "Why now? Why tell me all of this now?" He looked at her without hesitation. "Because I don't want to keep walking through this world hiding from the only person who ever made me want to believe in more than survival. I don't care about the company or the money or even the name. I care about this place, about how it makes me feel human again. And I care about you." Her eyes searched his, and something in her posture softened. She didn't smile, but her silence was no longer distant. "There are rules in this world," she said, "spoken and unspoken. Rules about who belongs where, about how love should look. But I've lived by rules my whole life, and I don't want to love by them too." Julian didn't reach for her. He simply waited, breath held while the chapel seemed to pause with them. Finally, she looked up at the stained glass, its reds and blues casting soft light on her face, and she said, "I want to believe that love isn't limited by where we come from, that it isn't something we earn by being perfect or good or born into the right family." He nodded, unable to speak. "Then let's find out," she said. It wasn't a confession or a promise. It was something stronger, an invitation to begin again, not as strangers, not as Jack and Elena or Julian and the priest's daughter, but as two souls who had learned that the truest kind of love is the one that blooms not in certainty, but in the willingness to see each other clearly and stay anyway. The days that followed were unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. The rhythm of her life, once guided by the quiet discipline of candles, prayer, and routine, now pulsed with something she had never dared to crave: possibility. She still sang at Sunday Mass, still arranged flowers at the altar, still cleaned the pews after evening service. But everything had changed. Julian no longer arrived at night, like a ghost seeking shelter. He came in daylight, unafraid, stepping into her world not as a stranger, but as someone who finally understood its worth. For the first time, Elena allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the stone walls of the chapel, not one that rejected her past, but one that expanded it. They spent more time together, not hidden in corners or cloaked in silence, but openly walking through the snow-covered paths behind the chapel, talking about the lives they had before and the ones they were beginning to imagine. She showed him her favorite bench under the maple tree where she used to read as a child. He told her about the cabin he bought with his first paycheck but never visited, tucked in the Adirondacks, waiting for someone to make it a home. They shared memories like confessions, not with shame, but with the reverence of two people learning to trust without fear. But Halebrook was a small town, and small towns carry long memories and fast-spreading whispers. It began with murmurs, curious glances at the market, raised eyebrows in the coffee shop, questions disguised as pleasantries. "Who's the man spending so much time at the chapel? Is he just passing through?" "You know Elena's like a daughter to Father Daniel. I hope he's not taking advantage." It didn't take long for someone to recognize Julian, not as Jack, the quiet visitor, but as Julian Blackwell, the disgraced billionaire who had disappeared from headlines just months earlier. The news spread like wildfire, reaching even the ears of Father Daniel. Elena was in the rectory kitchen preparing soup when he entered, his face unreadable, his movements deliberate. He sat across from her at the wooden table where they had shared hundreds of meals, his hands folded, his voice calm. "You love him," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. She didn't flinch. "Yes," she answered simply. He nodded slowly, eyes studying her. "And he loves you?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The silence that followed was not disapproving, but pained. "I've never told you the truth about your mother," he said suddenly, catching her off guard. She set the spoon down, heart beginning to race. "She came here once, years after she left you. She had remarried, had another child. She said she regretted everything but had no place in your life anymore. She left money, a letter I never gave you. I thought protecting you from that pain was the right thing." Elena's breath caught in her throat. "Why now?" she asked. "Because loving someone means not hiding from the truth," he replied. "And if you're going to build a future with Julian, you need to do it without shadows." That evening, Julian returned to the chapel to find Elena standing by the altar, the letter from her mother in her hands. She handed it to him, and he read it in silence, then folded it carefully and returned it. "I'm sorry," he said. She shook her head. "I'm not," she answered. "Because maybe it took losing one mother to find the strength to become my own person." The next morning, the front page of a local paper featured a photo of Julian stepping out of the chapel, the headline bold, "Disgraced tech heir finds sanctuary in Halebrook, billionaire's love affair with priest's daughter." Reporters began circling the property. Drones hovered over the chapel roof. Strangers came to the pews not for prayer, but for gossip. The peace of their small town shattered overnight. Julian offered to leave, to take the storm with him, to disappear again if it meant protecting her, but Elena refused. "I won't pretend this doesn't hurt," she said, "but if I ask you to run now, I'm telling the world I'm ashamed of loving you, and I'm not." She stood in the center of the chapel and faced the reporters as they arrived, answering every question with calm honesty, never raising her voice, never shrinking back. "Yes, I love him," she said. "Yes, I knew who he was. No, I'm not confused or manipulated or naive. I'm a woman who has known Faith her entire life, and right now, loving him feels like the most faithful thing I've ever done." Father Daniel stood beside her, not with sternness, but with pride. "My daughter was raised to believe that faith without action is empty," he told them, "and I see no greater act of faith than choosing to love someone fully, knowing the world may not understand." The media storm burned bright but fast. Within a week it faded, the cameras moved on, and the world turned to another scandal. But what remained in Halebrook was something stronger: respect. The townspeople saw not a scandal, but a love that had been tested and endured. Julian began using his resources to help repair the church roof, fund scholarships for local students, and bring new life to a town he had once only meant to hide in. He didn't buy their silence, he earned their trust. Still, the biggest gesture came quietly. One evening, as the last of the snow melted into spring, Julian asked Father Daniel if he could borrow the chapel for a few minutes. The old man smiled knowingly and handed him the key. When Elena entered later, she found the altar lined with candles, soft music echoing through the high ceilings, and Julian standing at the front, not with a ring or speech, but with open hands. "I don't want you to walk away from this place," he said. "I want to build something with you, not away from your world, but beside it." She stepped toward him, her heart steady, her voice sure. "And I don't want you to carry your past like it's a curse. It brought you here, didn't it?" He nodded. "Then maybe it wasn't a fall," she whispered. "Maybe it was grace." They stood together beneath the stained glass, not in a wedding, not yet, but in something stronger. The decision to stay, the decision to love out loud, the decision to stop hiding. And as the final candle flickered against the dusk, they knew they were no longer running from who they were, but toward who they were becoming. Spring arrived in Halebrook with a quiet gentleness, the kind that brushed across windowsills and thawed even the most stubborn patches of ice hidden beneath chapel stones. The snow that once blanketed the town in silence now gave way to bird song and green shoots pressing up through soil that had waited patiently beneath the cold. Elena found herself walking barefoot in the garden behind the rectory, feeling the earth beneath her feet for the first time in months, breathing in the promise of something new. It was in this season of renewal that something unexpected happened, something neither she nor Julian could have foreseen. They had begun planning a life, not with lavish gestures or announcements, but with simple choices. Julian had quietly purchased a small plot of land just beyond the town's edge, near a ridge that overlooked the valley. They spoke of building a home there, a modest one, with a kitchen that smelled like bread and a porch that faced the sunrise. Elena imagined it often, her fingers tracing blueprints over coffee, her thoughts drifting toward future holidays, garden beds, laughter in the evening light. She no longer questioned whether she was meant for more. She only wondered how deeply love could grow when it was watered every day by kindness and trust. But peace, however well earned, is never guaranteed. One morning, as Julian was returning from a meeting with a local nonprofit he had agreed to fund, a black SUV pulled up beside him on the old main road. The windows rolled down, revealing a sharply dressed woman with cold eyes and a clipped voice that could cut through steel. Her name was Evelyn Blackwell, his mother. It had been nearly 2 years since they had spoken, and even longer since they had looked each other in the eye. She stepped out without ceremony, heels clicking against gravel, and said only 3 words before he could respond. "We need to talk." Julian didn't argue. They sat inside the SUV, and Evelyn wasted no time. She had seen the stories, of course, the photos, the scandal, the public spectacle. She said she had come not to reclaim him, but to warn him. The board of directors had launched an investigation into Julian's departure, into his knowledge of internal corruption, and into financial ties they feared could be used against the company. "You've made enemies," she said flatly. "People who are more powerful than I ever was. And they're not just angry you've embarrassed them." Julian's jaw tightened. "I don't care what they think." Evelyn didn't blink. "You should, because they've found your weakness." It was a statement that landed with the force of a punch. He knew what she meant. Not money, not reputation. "Elena, they know she's everything to you," she continued. "And they're not above destroying her if it means silencing you." Julian left without another word, his mind racing, heart pounding. By the time he reached the chapel, Elena was lighting the evening candles, her face glowing in the warm light, unaware that the very love that had once saved him was now being used as a threat. He didn't tell her that night. He held her hand, ate dinner quietly, listened to her hum as she read beside the fireplace, and tried to memorize the peace she carried so easily. But the next morning he was gone. Alina woke to an empty bed, a note resting on the pillow, the ink smudged slightly as if written in haste or with shaking hands. "I love you. That's why I have to go. Please don't follow me." Her breath caught in her chest, and for the first time in years, she didn't pray, she ran. To the chapel, to the garden, to the bookstore. But he wasn't there. He had disappeared the way he came, quietly, without asking permission. Weeks passed. Father Daniel tried to reassure her, reminding her that sometimes those we love the most must face their battles alone. But Elena was not a woman who waited in shadows anymore. She made calls. She contacted people Julian had once trusted. And finally she found him. In a corporate apartment outside New York City, buried in legal battles and boardrooms, trying to dismantle the last of what he had built. She arrived without warning, walked into the lobby, ignored the assistant's protests, and stepped into the office where Julian sat alone, exhausted and hollow. He looked up and froze. "I asked you not to come," he said, voice low. She didn't answer right away. She crossed the room, stood before him, and took his hand. "Then you don't know me at all." He let out a shaky breath. "They threatened you. And you think leaving would protect me?" she asked, her voice firm. "You think running makes me safer?" "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted. "You ask people to believe in you, Julian," she said, "but you never asked me if I believed in myself." Tears welled in his eyes, not from guilt, but from the realization that in trying to save her, he had stolen her voice. She pulled him up from the chair and said, "I didn't love Jack the stranger. I love Julian, the fighter, and if this is your fight, then I will be at your side, not behind you, not watching from some chapel, but here." Together they faced the board. Together they released documents that exonerated him and exposed the corruption for what it was. And when the dust settled, when Julian finally stepped down, not in disgrace, but in triumph, he walked out of that building, not as a CEO, but as a man in love, a man unafraid, a man whose greatest legacy would not be the billions he once controlled, but the woman who taught him how to live without fear. Back in Halebrook, spring gave way to summer. The garden behind the chapel bloomed with new colors, and for the first time in years, Alina sang not just in the chapel, but in the town square, her voice echoing across cobblestones and open windows. Julian stood among the crowd, no longer hiding. The town no longer whispered. They cheered. In the evening, they sat together on the bench beneath the maple tree. He held her hand, she leaned against him, and the future, once uncertain, stretched out before them like a prayer finally answered. The sun dipped below the ridge as warm amber light spilled across the chapel lawn, casting long shadows through the trees and wrapping the garden in a quiet glow. Elena stood by the old bench beneath the maple, her fingers laced gently with Julian's as they watched the wind play with the petals of the newly bloomed lilies she had planted just weeks before. The breeze carried the scent of lavender, and earth, and something softer, something like peace. The chapel bell rang softly in the distance, not a call to prayer, but a reminder of time passing, of moments built, one breath at a time. They hadn't rushed into marriage. It wasn't about grand ceremonies or lavish vows. Their bond had been tested, not by time alone, but by truth, by separation, by the kind of love that doesn't burn with spectacle but holds steady like a flame sheltered from wind. When Julian finally asked, he did it the same way he had first held her, quietly, with a trembling sort of reverence. He knelt in the garden, not with a ring but with a simple question, his voice tender. "Will you keep choosing me, even when the world forgets our story?" Elena didn't cry. She smiled. "Only if you keep choosing me when it remembers." The ceremony was small, held at the chapel under the same stained glass that had once watched her pray alone. Father Daniel walked her down the aisle, not as a priest, but as the only father she had ever known, his eyes shining with pride. There were no reporters, no camera flashes, no luxury gowns or designer suits, only white flowers picked from their garden, candles they had lit together, and a silence so full it felt like music. When they exchanged vows, they did so not as perfect people, but as whole ones, carrying every scar, every mistake, every lesson they had earned with love. In the days that followed, the town didn't change much. The coffee shop still served lukewarm tea, the bookstore still creaked with every step, the church bells still rang on Sundays. But something in the air had shifted. People walked with their heads a little higher. Strangers held eye contact longer. There was a belief now, spoken or not, that love could be more than fairy tales and fleeting promises. It could be chosen, daily, gently, stubbornly, even when the odds weren't kind. Alina often returned to that moment in the confessional, the one where she first whispered her fear that falling in love might be a sin. She thought now how wrong she had been. The sin would have been silence. The sin would have been pretending that love didn't belong to people like her and Julian, but love had always belonged to them, not because they were perfect, but because they were brave enough to open the door, to let it in, and to fight for it when the world told them not to. They didn't need to prove anything anymore, not to the world, not to themselves. They lived each day with quiet joy, planting gardens, writing music, visiting schools, holding hands as they walked the chapel grounds at dusk. Sometimes the past reached for them in headlines or memories, but they no longer ran. They simply stood still, together. Because love like theirs wasn't built in the absence of storms. It was shaped by the rain, rooted in the soil of every sorrow and joy they had weathered side by side. And if their story left behind a message, it would be this: faith isn't always found in pews or prayers. Sometimes it's found in the eyes of another, in the quiet courage to love without permission, to hope without guarantee, to choose someone not because they fit the mold, but because they feel like home,